I'm George Miglogenis, by the way, author and a journalist, but I've been out of the media now for about a year and a half, so working on a book and a couple of other projects. Now, I'm pleased to be able to introduce our 5 panellists today. The structure is essentially, I'm going to throw an opening question to each of them. I'm going to throw the question once, I'm not going to ask it 5 times. Get a very, very quick response, we'll have a quick discussion and then throw it open to the floor. I think majority of this session will be an engagement with the audience. So have a good listen to what they've got to say to begin with and bring your best question to the table. We'll be having a microphone travelling the audience. A couple of other things to remember, obviously. Your phones are still on silent, but if you're tweeting, the hashtag is C20. And I'll begin with a very, very quick introduction for each of our panellists. Tim Costello, of course, who you've already heard from. Chief Executive of World Vision Australia and Chair of the C20 Steering Committee, one of Australia's best-known community leaders and a sought-after voice on social justice, leadership and ethics. Is that the way you wrote it?
That's it.
That's it. We've got Simon Longstaff, who's the Executive Director of the St James Ethics Centre. He is also a philosopher and is reading for his doctorate at Magdalene College in Cambridge. Emeritus Professor Gillian Triggs, President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Prior to this, she was Dean of Faculty of Law and Challis Professor of International Law at the University of Sydney and Director of the British Institute and International and Comparative Law, a terrific CV there. Joshua Meltzer is a Fellow in Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institute and an Adjunct Professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. He works on international trade law and policy issues. And Jason Eads is a Gunai man from the eastern part of Victoria and is the CEO of PwC's Indigenous Consulting, former Managing Director of Eads Consulting Group, a small firm specialising in Aboriginal policy and program design and reviews, which included clients from some of Australia's largest corporates, governments, NGOs and Indigenous community organisations. Now, just by way of introduction, I think one thing to bear in mind about Australia's hosting the G20 this year, remember, we were the last rich nation standing during the global financial crisis, and the G20 did come into its own in 2008-09 with that very rapid global stimulus response. Now, there's a couple of things obviously going wrong in the first world, which is a bit unusual time for the first world because many years after the GFC, we've got a big debate going on in the West at the moment on inequality. In fact, it's probably the word of 2014. And in fact, when Time magazine does its Person of the Year, it probably won't do a Person of the Year, it'll do a Word of the Year, and it will be inequality, if I have any predictive powers. Also in Europe, we've seen a reversion to that chauvinism of an earlier period after almost a similar economic shock in terms of the Depression in the 1930s. Now, what do we pride ourselves in as Australians? The fair go, and probably world's best practice for multiculturalism. I think these are 2 things to bear in mind as we host the G20 this year, that we've got a very good story to tell as a host, and not that the world is coming here to learn from us, but the debates that we're going to be running through the G20, I think, should be informed to some extent by what we do right. Now, the question for each of the panellists, I'm going to ask it quickly: what can civil society bring to the G20? And I'll give you each about 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll have a quick discussion after that, and then we'll throw to the audience. Thank you. Beginning with Tim.
So Australia has 210 communities, about 150 nations represented, or national backgrounds, and as George said, is the most multicultural nation in the world, which I think is the gift of the Australian hosting, if we can get it right, that living under the rule of law without historic, ethnic, religious animosities being played out is possible. And that notion of a fair go is incredibly important for that multicultural success. Look, I think C20 is a recognition that there is a profound trust deficit with politicians. You look at the graphs over the years and trust in all governments has just plummeted. When governments need to ask for a sacrifice from their people, they're no longer in a position to even ask it. They're so distrusted. And therefore policy gets frozen, lobby groups that are more powerful win, and the turning inwards is actually terrifying for the globe. So I think coming together as a G20 civil society is that moment of articulation, vision, clarity, and legitimation, hopefully, for governments to keep the beacon of what the world should be and the policy should be in front of them.
Simon?
I want to pick up where some of the things that Tim mentioned. Firstly, I think that the problem is not just a problem of trust, but a problem of legitimacy. That's got some pretty profound implications. When you lose trust, then the costs of doing things increases as people compensate for that. But when you lose legitimacy, the ability to do anything is lost. And what I think we're seeing now, although it may seem a bit subtle in a country like Australia, is a fundamental recalibration of the notion of sovereignty of states. I was talking to a group from up in the northern rivers of New South Wales who've recently blocked the exploration of a gas company in their region. It had all the licences it needed at the time from the state government. Governments had made all of the agreements they needed to do, and in an earlier time that would have been enough. But those communities are now determined not to allow it, and they have the capacity to stop it. And I think it's probably going to be missed, although I hope something like this will bring it to the attention of governments sitting around the table at the G20, that what they assume about their sovereignty is no longer applicable, not even here, and that means that civil society itself is starting to take on a much more significant role in terms of how it organises from the ground up. And that's going to be a very profound story. We see it in large scales overseas and we see it here as well.
Well, civil society obviously brings enormous power and strength as representing the public to a very high degree. But one point that I wanted to make that builds on something Tim said, and that is that in Australia we do have a rule of law-based understanding of the interests of civil society. And we're not talking only about ethics and morality, but we're talking about the law. And so the Australian Human Rights Commission that I represent operates from a human rights perspective. And it fascinates me in this job to see how leaders of civil society are in fact better informed about their legal rights. They use the legal system and they insist on rights through that system. The other point I wanted to make is that the national human rights bodies generally throughout the world, and there are over 100 of them, play a very important bridge between civil society and government. And I think it's a bridge that needs to be understood and used more frequently, partly because civil society is so often well-resourced for collecting the data and information, and to channel that back to government using a body like a Human Rights Commission and or using the courts are ways of ensuring that we operate through a rule of law-based system.
Joshua?
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to say thank you, for the invitation to be here today. It's clearly, I think, with the size of this audience today, a testament, I think, to a general view of how important civil society can be. And I think the key point I just want to make is I think this ultimately is about governance, whether we're talking about at a domestic level or at an international level. And I think specifically, if we're thinking about this in terms of the G20, one of the key questions is what is the G20 and what is civil society's role in that space in order to improve governance and outcomes? We've got the 20 largest economies, we've got developed economies, we've got emerging economies, and in that space I think there's a very interesting and specific role that civil society can play to both support the outcomes of the G20, to communicate what those outcomes might be to populations more broadly. I think the other really interesting thing, which I think is also really important, is that this is also an opportunity for civil society to itself engage and learn from other members of civil society. I mean, there's a constant refrain, I think, that civil society at times tend to be a north-south divide. It's often an arm of wealthier countries, and it's not really about developing countries. And I think the fact that this event brings together civil society from developing countries and developed countries from different areas of civil society provides an opportunity to overcome those narratives and to actually present a more coherent and cohesive approach.
Good morning, everybody. I guess that there's two things that sit in my mind. Firstly, around how we separate things into civil society, that we have this forum kind of separating, say, from G20 itself. And and we tend to talk about things in isolation from one another. The fact is that we're all a part of society and that we all have a part to play. And I think whilst ever we remain separated and don't work together as a collective, we won't see real change. The other thing, obviously, that sits in my mind is around the world's Indigenous populations and what we have to contribute to not only society but the world at large. Here in Australia, when we talk about multiculturalism, I think we often forget that we have over 200 Indigenous groups here in Australia alone. And indeed, when you look around the world, there's a lot more. These communities have an enormous amount to contribute to society, and yet they remain at the margins, and yet they also remain one of the most disadvantaged, populations in the world. So I think we do need to ensure that it's not only talking to the same people all the time, but we do actually bring in different thinking and different points of view.
Thank you. I'm going to throw, now it's a general question based on each of your responses. Again, it's a general question. I don't want to pick off any individual, and we'll do it in order again if we could. I'm involved in G20 through the Lowy Institute, which is the advisory board that's been sort of arm's length from government, trying to help build up the agenda. And the question that's always been turning over in my head is, what do we actually want from the G20? Do we want to have identified a set of problems and solve them in November? Or do we want to be able to identify problems in a more active sense, maybe creating an agenda for problem resolution down the track? Because there's always a bit of a difficulty, to my mind, and I've covered a lot of these conferences in the past and now been inside, watching the machinery of this thing. At some level there's going to be a bit of pressure to just calm the argument down and come up with some sort of communal resolution. Now, through the C20, I guess just ask each of you whether you would like to solve problems or whether you'd like to identify them. If I can be that vague, I think you understand what I'm getting at, because if you have a terrific communique at the end of it and we haven't advanced the cause at all, maybe that's not the way to go about it. Just also mindful of the fact that you don't want to be bomb throwers. At the same time, you're in the tent now, and you should make the most of it. Beginning with Tim.
Yeah, so I think we are both identifying and pointing to solutions. I think most of us in this room have read the position papers we've got. Whatever the communique comes up with, it's unlikely to be very different to what most of us know are the solutions. The truth is the G20 works on consensus. And when you've got 200 sovereigns who are looking to their national interest, G20 is not the 200, but that's how the world's governed. It's not a great mechanism for what is the mismatch of the problems we're trying to solve, and therefore I think we're really trying to get leaders to form personal relationships significant enough for them not just to listen to their finance minister or their political constituency, but to actually go, let's take a risk, let's step out, let's have confidence because of this democratic deficit, because of this paralysis, because the problems are global and we are the leaders, let's actually have the confidence to have a go. So I think it's an exercise in that as much as identifying the problems. The problems we know, I think we know, what we need to do is position papers that are as high as this roof on solutions. It's actually acting. It's the lack of action that is worrying us.
Yeah, part of me wants to be realistic. It needs to be realistic about what's possible in these settings, as Tim was suggesting. Part of me wants to be idealistic too, so a kind of pragmatic idealism, I suppose, where I would want to go. My fear is that these situations are too often coloured by where they started rather than where they need to go, and that this will be a very good process for solving some of the problems that need to be solved, but not all of the ones that ought to be solved, that there are some things which won't even be put on the table. And as such, we will be missing an opportunity to foreshadow the kinds of developments that need to be put in place to achieve the kind of broad ends that everybody agrees about for a society, for societies that are going to flourish. So I think, yes, the relationships are really important. What I fear, though, is going to happen, and this is where I think a little bit of gentle bomb throwing may be useful, is that no one will dare to think outside of the prescribed box that the Sherpas have put together for them. And if they haven't had enough vision about this at the moment, it will be a wasted opportunity which will then be replicated in the future. And that's one thing I would hope that Australia could do as a host of this, is to loosen things up enough for different kinds of questions to be asked. And if we get some solutions but some new questions, and to understand we need to do something about it, that will be a good outcome.
Well, I'm very encouraged by this opportunity at this G20 to link through C20, because I think there has been a disconnect between business and finance and global economics and the concerns of civil society and, from my point of view, obviously human rights. I think we can see this mechanism of the various groups linked to G20 as a very, very valuable tool to, I hope, see issues like the concerns of civil society, human rights law, put on the agenda, and to pick up the point that many have made so far today, and that is the link between economic prosperity and sustainable prosperity, productivity and integration in society. And we see this at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Of, let's say, 20,000 complaints and inquiries we get a year, 2/3 of them arise with business in employment and delivery of goods and services. So that we at least have that database, and I'm sure it's true of other countries that are represented here, that the link between achieving outcomes for youth employment, engagement of women, increasing productivity with big business and small to medium business is absolutely forged with iron, and therefore we need to work with this kind of collaboration. Now, I think we can identify the problem, but we do need solutions. I agree we need action. I would like to see some sort of almost an MOU or a collaborative arrangement that could be made between G20 that includes these issues on their agenda, so that it's not a separate group, but an integral part of their agenda, and that we work then for the third of these C20 meetings at the next G20.
You're not suggesting the abolition of the C20 for the next one?
Well, not, a little early, but in due course.
In due course, thank you. Joshua?
George, so my short answer probably to your question is both, but I'll add that, you know, I think it was sort of implicit in what you were saying that what the opportunity is for Australia this year round is to conceive of an agenda for the G20 which is no longer about solving the financial crisis, and sort of puts the G20 onto a path in a post-financial crisis world that it can achieve some outcomes, and also, I think importantly, identify other areas where it can work from. I mean, the challenge clearly is, you know, the question we need to ask ourselves, this is a really important opportunity which happens annually to get the 20 leaders of the largest economies in the world to sit down and talk to each other. So the question is, what is it about that space that you want leaders to do that they can't do on their own, that the interaction amongst the leaders is somehow important and an additional that can produce an outcome that acting alone is not going to be possible to do? I mean, I think Tim's point about trust is key here, and the thing for the C20 is, I think the message is that this is sort of going to be a long process, in the sense that this trust-building process, which is clearly lacking at the moment internationally, is going to take a long time to build. The G20 in that sense is still, I think, at a very early stage. And I think finally, it's also an important opportunity for, again, getting back to my original point, I think, about governance. How do these other groups interact with each other? You know, we have the G with the C, the B, the L, and I think it's also an opportunity for an appreciation and an opportunity to build bridges among these groups, you know, working in partnership to try to identify common outcomes which can then be leveraged together into the G20 to produce an outcome which can be sustainable over time.
I think it's that last point that you just made that really draws it together for me, about pulling together and have an action-based focus in which, you know, real outcomes and meaningful outcomes can be achieved, not by one group in isolation, but what the power of bringing those groups together can actually drive. And so for me, thinking about G20 in Australia, yes, it's post, well, is it really post the crisis? Because I think that there is some economies around the world that wouldn't think that. But it's a tendency to just focus on economics on their own and not consider the other elements of economics, and the fact that we look at business as something that sits over here on the side. For the first 20 years or so of my career, it was all spent in community sector, and recently I've moved into private sector work. And what I'm starting to see and understand is that there actually is a role of bringing together. You can create economic activity, create businesses for goods that still deliver good societal outcomes. It doesn't have to be all about, you know, just for a commercial outcome. So I think that the challenge really is to start thinking different about the world's economics and what really delivers good economic outcomes.
George, can I just ask?
Yep, go for it.
That begs the question as to whether this summit is purely about economics, though, and whether it's still being held captive by the GFC, or whether or not it's looking at a broader political agenda and it can actually bring that into bear. Because if everything is just simply going to have to be reduced to an economic conversation, then we'll never actually solve some of the problems that are pressing.
If I can just maybe add a thought there. The immediate crisis response in sort of 2009, when Gordon Brown was chairing, was really about stopping the Great Depression. But the consequences of the GFC have been felt today. When we talk about inequality and we talk about sort of basically the rise in the hard right and neo-Nazism in Europe, these are all functions of economics. But
they're not soluble purely by talking about them in terms of economics.
True. In a sense, economics is the thing that's created the problem in the first place. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking in terms of cost and benefit in terms of your recommendations, but I think you're right. Now, I'm going to give everybody in the room a chance to ask a question.
Good morning. My name is Africa Zanella, and I'm an international management consultant, and amongst other things. I'm hearing very well from all the panel the issue of governance, the issue of inclusion, human rights, ethics, and in particularly, Tim, I congratulate you on your language with regards to passion and vision. Civil society and the G20. Is there any way that we can now look at the issues of gender in a serious manner, given that G20 2010 created a declaration in Los Cabos? So my question here is, I'm hearing from everyone, obviously, the concept of women, inclusion in the world is a global issue. It's not just about child-minding facilities, it's about fiscal, it's about land rights, it's about the right to express a voice, etc., etc. So civil society and G20, why does it matter? I think it matters a lot that we bring some sort of issue of governance to the G20 and make them accountable for the declarations they have made in the past, especially in Los Cabos 2010, and see where this agenda on gender and women issue is going. And I think we have a very important role to play in that area. So I'd like to hear your comments. I'm sure that we all are going to agree, but what are we going to do about it? Thank you.
You can take it all in order, or if anyone is sort of, because I think if we answer each question 5 times, we might not get as many questions from the floor. Sorry, this is just, I'm improvising here as the world's worst moderator.
Well, the gender agenda is of course, absolutely fundamental for all sorts of reasons, not least of which being global productivity, the shocking waste of resources, the heartbreaking loss of capacity for women to be engaged in the global environment as it develops so rapidly. But I think the point that you make that I'd most like to pick up on is this notion of accountability, because we have so many resolutions, so many declarations, so many communiques, so many things that voice these views in relation to the inclusion of women, the education of women, the opportunities for women, and their role in all sorts of areas, whether it's Indigenous matters, land rights, expression, employment opportunities, and so on. I would like to see exactly what you've suggested, that before we come to the next G20, you have some sort of review in advance of it that assesses the extent to which all the grand statements made in the communiques are actually being met or on the pathway to being met. Now, that's not just gender, it's many of the other issues that of course emerge, but I think gender is now obviously a vital one, and it's one that leaders we're now seeing around the world, our own foreign minister, but we now have women in senior roles with banks and financial institutions, and I'd like to see that leadership be reflected also in how we hold bodies to account, including G20.
I too think the accountability questions are key. I think the gender issue, everybody I hope would agree with that. I once had this crazy idea of putting in every major city a giant promise wall, which was just a wall where constantly it put up what people had said they would do and then just silently saying what has actually happened so that you could do it. And citizens could gather there and just watch and see how things were unfolding.
Can I add to that though? I think it does need to move beyond, like, I totally agree that gender equity is an absolute must, but so too is diversity in its full sense. Because if we end up with just gender being addressed and the fullness of diversity not being addressed, we actually have people from the same background, like minds, actually talking to one another, and that does not generate the kind of change that we need either.
Thank you. Hands up, the hands are up. This gentleman here, as I said, I'm going to work my way back up to the top, hopefully get you all a question before we're out.
My name is Phil Jones. I'm from the New South Wales Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. One of the things that has concerned me this morning and concerned me with Jeffrey Sachs's contribution is that there seems to be no real acknowledgement that the economy does have a limit in its growth. Now, I know that this can be qualified in various ways by saying that we can have an inclusive economy, that the economy is, and there are arguments, a whole range of arguments, which I won't go into, for saying, you know, we've got to have economic growth. But I do think that there is a need to begin to start thinking about the transition to the steady state economy. Now, this is not included in any of the recommendations, and I would like to put forward such a recommendation. And just to take up Simon's point, I think even in this group, there is a necessity to think outside the box. Economic growth cannot go on infinitely.
Just before we start...
Or can it? Not a comment.
Yeah. Just before we start, though, we haven't had much economic growth for the last few years, and basically Europe's almost ablaze. So, you know, I'm not trying to counter your point, but the context in which this G20 has been held is in the aftermath of a huge economic shock and with big issues of inequality and social cohesion.
Yes, I think that in part that's my point, that if we are forever focused on economic growth, then that, in a way, detracts from an understanding of our true problem. It's like an alcoholic not noticing or not acknowledging that that is a kind of a key part of his problem.
Okay, far away. Gillian?
Can I just make a short point? I don't at all disagree with the core point you're making, but I have recently returned from China. We have big projects there on human rights, working with China, and it really is remarkable to see how economic growth and business have brought, conservatively, 300 million people out of poverty, and that is the most heartening observation. Now, there are many problems, and the Chinese perhaps are the first to recognise it, but I don't know what the answer is to this problem, but clearly you need that economic growth to achieve that reduction from poverty for those people.
I just love the irony in an organisation for the advancement of the steady state. But on the serious point, I think that it depends a little bit on the kind of economy that one has and how it's founded. If it's based on the consumption of ever-increasing amounts of raw materials, if the size of the footprint that it puts down on the planet and on people is crushing as a burden, then of course I think you can't wish for that because it just produces all of the problems. But I think that there's also the wit and the will, even within economics, to conceive of different types of economy that don't have those effects. So I'm a little bit more open-minded about the notion of economic growth per se, depending on how it's achieved and what the character of the economy is itself.
I would just add to that, I think your question does strike right at the heart of the G20 assumption, which is a growth assumption to deal with social problems and waste and potential. And it strikes at the heart of human history in some ways. The great engine of human history is that parents will make unbelievable sacrifices just so their kids have a better, they would say, quality of life. They usually mean economic choices than they had. And we know in China it's the trade-off for you don't have democratic rights, but you've got economic growth, and if that trade-off isn't always rising, you know, there's going to be a legitimacy political question. We know it's the the way democracy in most of our countries, certainly Australia, works. Here in Australia, both sides of politics have talked to people in Mac mansions with 2 cars saying you're a victim, your energy bill has gone up, you're suffering, we feel your pain. One Labor politician, having a go at the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who wanted to tax people on $250,000 or more, said, I know a lot of people struggling on $250,000 a year. If you're on $250,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of richest people in Australia.
In the world.
In the world, absolutely. And that's Labor actually running those lines. So there is an invisible assumption that growth is always good, and it deals with the social problems, and it's so inculcated into the electorate now and the G20 agenda, it is very hard to know how to unpick that and critique it.
I'll just say very quickly, you know, just bringing it back to the G20, I mean, we always have to keep in mind that, you know, we had, with countries like China and in particular India in this, economic growth and a focus on growth is going to be absolutely key here. I mean, I think the real question is what type of growth do we want to see going forward? And so there's an agenda in that on sustainable development. I mean, there's a big debate on what that might mean, but, you know, issues like inequality, which come up, issues about sustainability in terms of the environment, climate change, all get wrapped up into that. So I think the real space here for the G20 is how do you have the type of economic growth going forward, which you clearly need, that is actually going to provide sort of a future for our children, our children's children, that we sort of want to see.
So I think that sustainability agenda is not part of what they're going to look at.
Yeah.
Hands up again. Okay, so I spotted one in the middle here, one row down. And as I said, I'll zigzag. Sorry, not that one. Okay, you can be next, but the lady in the front here.
Thank you.
My name is. I'll get you next. Yeah.
I'm next. Me?
Yeah.
Am I go now?
Sorry, one in front, and then you're next. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you. My name's Amanda. I'm from the Centre for Social Change. I did want to continue on from the point that was just made because, okay, we're talking about growth. I guess I heard this morning that our job, in a way, is to be interpreters and that we are speaking for vulnerable people who can't be here. But we're sort of talking about 2 different narratives and assumptions about the role of the economy, what the economy is, and what we're aiming for. And at the moment, we're sort of talking about growth as a given, as a good thing. And Julie Bishop said this morning that growth is the best weapon that we've got to address poverty. I'm assuming that there are people in the room who have a different analysis of that have different assumptions about what the economy is. I love the point about the fact that there are different kinds of economy in the world. What advice do you have about how we can talk to each other and send a message when we do have different assumptions? Because I'm coming from an assumption of I'd question growth. I think we've got plenty of evidence for the last 20 years of neoliberal economics that, you know, attacks things like the trickle-down theory. How can we bring other concepts such as well-being into it? It's not just about sustainable growth or inclusive growth. How do we get well-being on the agenda? How do we question some of these assumptions? What language can we use? What are the openings to have that discussion, I guess? I'm asking for advice.
Can I have a shot at that first?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm only the chair. Interesting question about growth in the last 20 years is most of it is based on access to cheap finance or cheap capital. So the Americans for the last 20 years, they've had a share market boom and then a debt boom, which has left them with what? Their middle class hasn't had a pay rise, a real increase in their disposable income in the last 20 years. So if your question, I'm not trying to reframe your question, but if you're looking at tools of translation, you need to assess the types of growth. So if you've got a problem of growth intuitively, even if the person you're talking to is assuming that growth is a good thing, you want to show them bad growth. So that's maybe one way to get into their conversation. Your assumption may be that all growth is bad. You know, I'm not saying that that's your assumption, but as I say, if you want to connect up with an economist in a conversation like that, start unpicking the types of growth that we've observed, especially in this generation, and most of it has been pretty crummy. In Australia, it's sort of minerals-based in the last 5 or 6 years. The previous 15 or 16 years, it was basically all productivity. Not all productivity, but it was sort of pre-China. So that's the suggestion I'd make. I may have misheard you completely, but you're asking for a tool to translate. So how would you talk to an economist about growth? show them what crappy growth looks like, because it all ends in tears.
Yeah, it's a point about means and ends.
It's still keeping it in the same box of growth of the formal cash economy,
Yeah.
capitalism, is ultimately a good thing. So maybe that's not. The evidence suggests that there's more resilience when people are still engaged in the informal economy or subsistence economy, that creates direct well-being. So it's just, how do we talk across that?
Yeah, no, I take your point. I'll throw to the panel.
Look, I think part of it is to do, which you're pointing to, is the difference between means and ends. If people treat growth as an end in itself, we just need growth because growth is good, then you're going to get all sorts of aberrations and problems, some of which you've spoken to.
Well, you get a bubble and then it bursts.
If on the other hand you see an economy as a means to an end, and growth and all these other bits, and then you ask them, well, what is the end it is supposed to serve? Then you start to get some rational conversation, some sensible conversation. And I like to think that the political component of something like the G20 is capable of articulating those ends. And I'm actually optimistic that when politicians, for all of the many things we feel about them, get together, there is within them still a capacity to have that better notion about what is the purpose of all of this in terms of the human flourishing that might be secured. Then there can be debates about what are the best means, but unless you're really sure about that, you won't secure the ends you have, because the means you choose will be inappropriate, which is why I think you've got to think outside the box a little bit about what kind of economy it is, the kind of core functions, these concepts of sustainability and other things which are excluded at the moment from the sort of conversation that will be taking place at the G20.
I would add that well-being question, I think, can be weaved into a growth story. So I often say to people who we in World Vision works with, the moral panic of a parent who can't provide clean water or education is terrible because they feel a failure. And greater growth in terms of greater income actually increases well-being. There's a line, and I'm not sure where you cross it, where greater wealth produces more drivenness, stress, anxiety, distance. You dissolve relationships because you actually are just pursuing growth. So it's always growth for whom, and the well-being question, I think, has to be woven into that. That's the real end.
I've got some of a microphone, but hang on, I'll just... More hands and I'll pick another one to take the second microphone. Well, sorry, where's the second microphone? Can I see that first? Yep. Okay. So we get this chap down the front here in the blue and red, and he can come next after this one here. Yep, and then the guy behind.
Thank you. My name's Victoria Whittaker. I'm from the Global Reporting Initiative. We produce an international publicly available sustainability reporting framework. I wanted to keep on this sustainable development, sustainability kind of topic. We have investors and lenders starting to take into account sustainability performance of companies and taking into account very seriously. They look at the way they treat their workers along the supply chain, the way they treat their employees, they reduce the impacts upon the environment. They think about how they're investing into the economy of the communities that they work in. And investors and lenders are starting to look at these issues and take them very seriously. They see that companies that perform well on sustainability actually perform well financially as well. They perform better than those that don't pay attention to issues of sustainability. I'm wondering, given that the G20 is about cooperation on international trade, and increasingly that agenda is crossing the lines and thinking more systemically around these types of issues. What would you like to see the G20 do on this sustainability agenda more broadly?
Panel?
Well, I'd very much like to see the G20 integrate into their agenda the questions that we've been discussing, including the ends, whether they're well defined in terms of well-being or sustainability, integration, diversity, and so on. But I think your organisation demonstrates something that I think is enormously important, and that is a greater level of data collection and research to understand the consequences of changes in behaviour. So when companies start to see that by treating their employees fairly, by flexibility in the workforce, by non-discrimination practices and so on, they start to see the benefits in their shareholder outcomes. Now, that's an outcome. It may not be one that impresses everybody, but it's nonetheless a very clear link between well-being, basic rights, civil society concerns and business. And I think that kind of research could underpin what the G20 is doing. So I think if the G20 were to fund that kind of research, so we've got a clearer understanding of the link between the concerns of civil society in the ways that I've described, that could then start to influence their judgment. Critically, it seems to me, we have to influence the leaders who set the agenda and speak to the agenda at the G20. And without that influence, in terms of these wider-ranging questions of well-being and concerns of civil society, it's really going to be very, very hard to influence the outcome of G20 meetings.
I'll just make a brief comment to that. I think your question's really is an excellent one for a couple of reasons. One is that it is important, I think, to highlight that in many respects businesses are being very forward-looking. I'm not saying all businesses, but it sort of opens up the point that we're in a world, I think, where a lot of aims are not necessarily coming together completely, but there's a lot of opportunity for businesses and civil society and other organisations to work together to achieve common goals, even if they're coming at it from different perspectives and different rationales. Now, the supply chain bit is kind of a complicated issue, but I think what it highlights is, there's a trade conversation going on over here. There's conversations about sustainable development going on in, let's say, a UN process. And, this highlights sort of what can the G20 do in this space. So one thing it can do is it can be a place for connectivity where, leaders can get together and talk about, okay, so there's a TPP negotiation or there's a WTO negotiation, there's a UN discussion here on sustainable development. How can we get some policy coherence where we're trying to inject some of the outcomes from here into that process here? And I think that's exactly where the G20 is very well suited, where leaders can give some top-level guidance into how then different aspects of government and negotiators can go off into their own spheres and take some of that learning and some of those lessons learned and bring that into an outcome that along the lines of what you're thinking about, which achieves goals which are good for trade and also for sustainable development.
Sorry, I said he'd go first and then you'd go next. Yep.
My name is Kshitij and I represent ActionAid. When the minister spoke, there was a very overt sense of trusteeship that she had towards the C20. She was almost saying, you give us your agenda and we will see what we can do about it. So how do we ensure that we don't end up being a compromised lot? Especially because, there was absolutely no mention of either redistribution or social justice in her speech. If she had used the word social even once, I would have joined the audience to applaud her. She didn't and I didn't.
Interesting perspective, thank you. No comment.
We do get compromised, not just with the dogma, but also the vocabulary. When we use terms like inclusion and exclusion, we also should understand that there is a dominant mainstream which either decides to include or to exclude. And with the G20, it's usually the powerful states who are essentially subservient to big corporates who are deciding either to include or to exclude. How do we get out of this and think out of the box?
Thank you. Let me ask a question, try and answer a question that resonates with me too. The G20 has invited us, because it's their G20, to be part of it, and largely, as you know, they've set the terms. They've got a pretty fixed view, and under the Australian presidency, a particular view. You've read in the public debates about why they didn't want climate change on the agenda. You've seen that not just the Australian government, but right-of-centre governments in the world are uncomfortable with the language around equality. They regard that as being red tape, a brake on investment, somehow slowing down the growth that they believe, with great conviction, is, what the G20, the Premier Economic Forum, is charged to do. So that's the world we're living in. That's how we're engaging. Our communique, and you heard it in my speech, I hope wasn't resiling from the things that civil society believe. And really it's saying our job in civil society is to see where opportunities appear, cracks widen in the political process where they own it, and kick wider those cracks, take those opportunities, voice what we say is fundamental if you're going to recover trust, have legitimacy, say, you know, we really heard. That's really what this process is about.
Sorry, yeah, thanks for waiting.
Okay, thanks. My name is Lesego Luate from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies in South Africa, based at the University of the Western Cape. We do research on land reform, large-scale land-based investments, water resource management, and small-scale fisheries. I want to commend the organizers. I think this is a useful platform to influence the G20 agenda. So just to start off by saying that. And then also, when we look at global economic development, poverty, inequality, these are very complex issues. I mean, you can tell from the discussions, very connected to theoretical positions, worldviews, ideologies, and also the way they manifest in the G20 environment. They manifest very differently. So from that position, I'm a little bit worried looking at the program that we've only got 10 minutes to discuss the communique today. And then we've got 10 minutes, rather 30 minutes the following day, which by then many of us might be operating at 0.5%.
So for Tim, I think.
I don't know if maybe we might be open to maybe giving ourselves a little bit more time to engage with the communique at the end of the day today, so that we give ourselves a better chance of having a communique that we can have buy-in into. Thank you.
So let me respond on behalf of that and the others in the C20 community, because we got your comments yesterday, and I resonate in terms of how do you get a process that actually has participation, people feel they own it. And we decided that this whole process is a rolling process, particularly the discussion groups with very targeted rapporteurs to be reporting back, which will be thrown up on overhead tonight, what you're hearing, what they're hearing. Is this where we're going? Is this picking up the sentiment? The issues that you put in your letter yesterday around those 4 areas and what you'd like in the communique, in fact, I think are represented, every single one of them, in the position papers. So I think we're on the same page. The actual wording of a communique, and if you're like me, you've been in gatherings where civil society fragments around a word in a plenary session, and then we debate each other for the next 2 hours over process, and then we go, how did business get everything they want? They just actually sailed in very clearly while we debated a word, represented a legitimacy question. So we've tried to say, in this process, we make it rolling, participatory, argue your case really strongly in those groups, and the rapporteurs are picking it up, feeding it back. You're going to be seeing whether that actually is a representation of what you were saying and what this consensus was. And please tweet your questions. We'll be answering them. If you're upset about, you know, where it's going, which you'll see at the end of today from this rolling discussion that's begun. That's how we're addressing it.
Thank you. I'm going to do 2 more questions. I'm going to grab one down the front here, and the lady next to Glyn Davis can be the last one.
Good morning. My name is Brandon Artong. I'm from Vision 2020 Australia. First, I just wanted to note that, particularly under the area of inclusive growth and employment, I noted that there's a very conspicuous absence of disability in highlights. Absolutely, women and girls, gender equality issues and youth, absolutely critical in that area. But given the disability affects, about 1 billion people around the world and has spin-off effects to family and friends that also encompass gender issues, women and girls and youth, I just sort of I want to put that on the table to think about over the next day or so. And Tim and Cassandra Goldie and others, I know you've said that the position statements aren't going to be tweaked or moved, but I want to put that on the table, and I'm hoping to talk about it throughout the next 2 days. But firstly, the other thing I want to ask a question about is around spending. We've talked a lot about the environmental settings, making sure that tax avoidance and those sorts of issues are addressed, and absolutely agree with those. But I think given that we are talking to the G20, the most powerful governments around the world, spending is a factor and essential in a conversation about inclusive growth. The governments need to actually look at how they invest and to ensure their populations, that people are engaged with the economic life, social life and others. So my question is, will we be talking about and providing advice around spending or more appropriate language, investment? Thank you.
Well, I'll just give my view, and I'm sure there's lots of views. Revenue collection in successful countries is about 30 to 40% of GDP. That's how you pay for education, health, disability. In developing countries, that's under 15%. And the whole point of revenue collection is actually to spend, to deal with inequality and disabilities and a whole range of things. The social justice mechanism is actually in spending. That's how social justice plays out. And certainly as the Australian government believe they only have a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and it's been a national audit here that didn't look at revenue, only at spending, and we've seen cuts in spending. That's a particular political view and agenda. When we start to talk about what we mean in infrastructure, we are hopefully talking about social protections, pension schemes, minimum wages, cash programs for the poor. We are talking about spending. That's the ultimate goal of getting leaders to say we are including everybody in the 2% growth we're aiming for. So for me, spending very much at the heart of it.
And I think, though, where that spending actually goes, because before someone was talking about this, dependency or government building this picture that we all need some kind of assistance from them, so that even the wealthiest feel that there is an entitlement to come from government, when in actual fact we should be looking at government investment being directed to those most in need. And it's not the case. But we often see that the first area of spending to go when governments are trying to pull back and say, well, this is only the revenue that we can generate, it's actually the programs designed to help the poorest in the community are the first to be hit. And the justification for that is, well, we can spend that money better. Well, I think we could probably invest it better, but to cut money from out of that segment and still continue to push it into other segments in the community that really don't require it is a major part of the problem.
Yes, I think you raise a vital question, because there's far too little public debate about the budget as a whole. We certainly have a debate about certain elements of the budget that are given media attention, but we don't often stand back and look at our budgets to say, well, why are we spending billions in these areas, or why are we spending much less in other areas? And I think that is one of the critical roles of civil society, that we should be encouraging discussion by our voting public to make some of these decisions. Several times a year I go to Canberra for government body agencies like mine to discuss various issues of budget, and I'm always shocked that the Australian Human Rights Commission gets quite a degree of public policy discussion, but must have one of the tiniest agency budgets in Australia, and billions of dollars are being spent on other government agencies, sovereign border control, customs, federal police, defence, etc., ASIO, and I could go on. And I think it's time we did have a public discussion about how that budget is determined, because certain sums are simply assumed from budget to budget with very little discussion about whether it really does need to be realigned. And of course the disability sector is one very important area that already seems to be rather under threat.
Final question. Sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but we're running a very tight program here.
Thanks. My name's Beth Slatcher. I'm a member of the public and a former health policy analyst. I have a question for each member of the panel, a very quick reflection. A lot of the discussion in the questions and answers for the panel have gone to the heart of the issue of accountability. And my question is whether you feel that the G20 needs an accountability mechanism, whether that's something we should be advocating for in the communique, and what role the C20 could play in that. Thanks.
Can I give you one word answer? Absolutely. I mean, I hate to think that we've solved the world's problems in this particular session, but if you can work up an accountability mechanism for every subsequent G20 meeting, and you might do a retrospective as well before you even bring, when you're designing the model, when you bring it to the table in November.
There are some scorecards, and I know John Curtin, a Canadian, has been working and publishing accountability, what we promised, where we didn't get to, Simon, so there are some in place. I think what you've said is right at the heart of whether the G20 will have ongoing legitimacy. Yeah. The difficulty is that the G20 doesn't even have a standing secretariat. It's the deal really was the G8 deals with foreign policy, the G20 deals with economic policy, and because it's consensual driven, it hasn't developed a whole lot of mechanisms that would help accountability. Excuse me.
I'll just add briefly, I think another important dynamic to think about from the accountability perspective, though this might not have been specifically where you're asking, is accountability amongst the leaders to each other. Because in a sense, you know, the usefulness of the G20 and what it's going to produce in part is going to be a product of developing mechanisms within the G20 itself which keep members accountable to each other, and the leaders can sort of go to each other at each successive G20 meeting to see if they've actually met you know, the commitments that they've been making. So I think that is also an important part of it. The sort of the top-down bit is complicated because you know, the G20 is clearly not globally representative, and I think they're still struggling with how do you have sort of an executive steering body, which in a sense the G20 is, which doesn't really represent most of the world in a sense, at least from a sort of country population and the rest of it. So, you know, the C20 and civil society generally I think is going to have a very important role there, both in terms of how it interacts with the G20, but also importantly how it interacts with the individual, you know, governments over the course of the years in between each meeting.
It's worth making the point that your question is also, are we willing to be accountable? I mean, ultimately, these people coming together represent governments. We are citizens, and there's different political systems. But as I was saying at the beginning, what they can do is changing, and whether or not the commitments made by the G20 are delivered on will be in part, and perhaps large part, due to us as well.
Okay, thank everybody. Do you want to wind me up or? Yeah, okay, wind me up. Could I get you just quickly to thank the panellists, Tim Costello, Simon Longstaff, Gillian Triggs, Josh Meltzer and Jason Eads. Thank you.